This is a documentary about colonialism and evangelizing, so it feels especially proper that I recognize the true holders of the land on which we're gathered tonight. This is the home of the Chumash and Tongva people, and I'd like to acknowledge their lives, their descendants, and their continued and ancestral stewardship of this land. So thank you. I want to start by the spectrum of opinions of John. There were people who thought he was a fool, people who thought he was a martyr. At the beginning of this project, where were you on that spectrum, and did you find yourself moving as you started making the film?
I mean, that's a great question. I think part of the reason we were intrigued at the get-go, John is sort of where this story starts, and I think we have our own opinions. I think one of the joys of the film, or any film really, for me, is allowing an audience to form their own opinion. Some people will come into this story with a lot of opinion, a lot of baggage, a lot of feelings about religion, or in fact what John had done. But to me, what did change is not so much how I felt about what John did, but the contextualization of John, the contextualization of the Sentinelese, and by pulling the thread on John, how much it connected with how many, questions that are relevant to all of us, whether you're a person of faith or a secular person.
I mean, because we like to work from the inside out and not the outside in. I mean, the films we've made have tended to be cinema verite, films with absolute total access. It's the condition often for making a film. And you're always negotiating those rules, but that's where we start. This is starting on the outside and trying to work in someone who's not with us, a family and a culture that's very wary and defensive, but looking for places of purchase with John and his story for someone who grew up with a faith that we don't share. That was hard, but it seemed to be necessary to try to find those points of contact. And, you could look at his Instagram feed and think, this is a young man who loved life. He loved the outdoors. I loved to camp too. I mean, in many ways, he wasn't a stranger. But I think what really unlocked the potential of understanding John was Patrick's letters and the emotion of a parent grieving the loss of a child, questioning that child's choices. Those were things that so many of us can really connect with. And I think Patrick Chau is a Christian, but also questioning some of John's choices. So that for us was what we called an emotional purchase into John as a complex human being. And it seemed that we owed him an effort to try to make sense of his complexities to the extent we could chart them.
I think it's easy to reduce his life to missionary, evangelist, but he also was an adventurer. And that spirit of adventure governed a lot of his choices as much as faith did. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, Jesse likes to talk about the two religions of John, which I think are very real, and I think you see in the film, and you see in his social media. He really was an avid climber, a very accomplished climber and outdoors person, and also read many of the same Boys on Adventure books that you did when you were little. And Tintin.
Well, you read Tintin too.
I read Tintin.
Don't put that on me.
I was deeply into Tintin. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of the religion of adventure, right? And National Geographic being part of that religion.
But in a way, it's not a casual word to describe these narratives as religion. We think of John's faith, of his fundamentalist faith, as a religion, but as Dan points out, it's a story. I mean, John believed in a story, and not everybody believes in that story. We certainly believe in a different set of stories, but actually there's an overlap, because we did overlap, as Amanda's saying, with some of the stories that fueled John. But I think part of the journey of the film is to understand the narratives that we absorb and don't think of as religion have the same force in our lives and the choices that we as a culture and as a country have made, and often at the expense of other cultures. And so I think that was a kind of revelation to us, that the film sort of folded back on us and our society in ways we didn't anticipate.
How early were you able to identify that the story was as much about how we see the people on this island and less about the way they might see us? Because I think it's raised at the end of the film, that it's an unknowable answer, but our bias is so much about what we bring to this experience rather than what they brought to their experience.
I mean, I'd say even from reading the news story about John going to North Sentinel Island back in 2018, I was immediately as intrigued by, what would make somebody want to do this? Contact a tribe that doesn't want to be contacted. What is that? And we've made films about radical faith before, but this had something else where I was as interested in who there's still an island out there that has not had contact, 2018, still 2023, or very limited contact. That was fascinating to me, the unknown of that in a Google mapped world and everything else. So to me, I think it was kind of immediate that I was as interested in the other part of this meet.
In Boys State, you're able to witness things in real time. Here, you're not. How do those limitations become the key to your artistic choices and how you're going to tell this story?
I think there was necessity is the mother of invention, and there were limitations of access. There was an absence of archival footage or any kind of evidence other than the diary and John's fateful and fatal contact with the Sentinelese, and also accessing John's inner life. And I think that we were extremely challenged by those factors and taking on this story, and very scared, frankly. And there were, first of all, there was a commitment of National Geographic to say, go for it formally. Animation was something of a leap of faith on their part, but also to the willingness to sort of look at themselves as an institution, National Geographic, and the coverage within the magazine and their documentary films about indigenous cultures. And I think they gave us permission to stretch. Animation was a stretch for us. I think that we loved that as a form because it was motivated by John's own enchantment of cartoon, of narrative, of animation, of Tintin, things we talked about. And there's a subjectivity to animation that we felt was appropriate in dramatizing the contact with the Sentinelese. So we gave ourselves permission to do that. But I think also the excavation of archive led us to sort of try to chart John's inner life in a way that was not otherwise present to us in what people had to say about him.
I mean, I think it's also a fundamentally different project to tell a past tense story. There's like a question of why are you telling this story? There's a question of who's telling the story. There's a question of how you tell the story, which Jesse just mentioned. But part of the joy, I think, of this past tense story is that we have these alter egos, the people who are in the film who are looking back. They're reflecting on their own journeys to these places, right? Their own islands, or in some cases, the actual island. And that perspective and that depth is, I think, part of what was so deep about this movie for me in hearing their reflection, looking back on a past tense event.
Just one quick note, John, which is that in the verite films we've made, they've often hinged on very deeply conflicted characters. I mean, those are the characters who make good drama. John was extremely challenging because he doesn't have much, at least in what we had access to, in doubt. He has almost no doubt. And it's hinted at. He goes to the island for a vision trip, and his pastor Cameron Silsby wonders, did he hear clearly from God in that moment when he makes the final decision to swim to North Sentinel? But that's hard, and I think that the anguish of Dan Everett, the missionary who goes to the Amazon, sort of helps us access some of that internal conflict that is present in all of us as human beings, and that John, I think, concealed carefully from most people around him.
So he leaves behind a 13-page diary that his family shares, and he also has a master plan that's double the length. And nowhere in that master plan do you see him doubting. It's really a roadmap, and it's just something he is going to accomplish come, I don't want to say hell or high water, but he's going to get done no matter what it takes. There's no hint of self-doubt in those.
I think only the closest you come is the description of the vision that comes to him in that final moment, and which was a really interesting debate in the edit room about whether we will let the audience experience it kind of unmediated or actually narrate it as John describes it. And because clearly that was for him, brought clarity to the question of what he should do. And I think, why Levi, his friend Levi's statement at the end of the film is actually so potent too. It's that, John actually he loved life. He didn't have a death wish. He was willing to risk death to live his faith. but he loved life as much as all of us do.
You have what you call these alter egos, these voices throughout the film. I want to mention something that Adam Goodhart says, and that is there's a fine line between faith and madness. And it sounds like John didn't see that playing out in himself, but some of the people around him, maybe not at the time, but now, are more honest about that difference. Is that something, as you're thinking about other voices and what they're saying, that they can hone in on that idea of where that line is and where it was for John?
I mean, I think, again, a point of connection for me in this film is this conversation between father and son. And the John's father, Patrick, is extremely religious, but is in all those letters processing not just his emotional, trying to make sense of what's happened in losing his son to the radical act of what happened, but also theologically trying to make sense of how do we diverge in this space. And I think without calling it madness, I think he is really kind of working that out for himself.
Well, he calls it a whirlpool.
Yeah.
Right.
And which is because that puts the responsibility on an external force. And I think the film does gently acknowledge that there are external forces that ushered John to his fate. Bobby Parks, All Nations, people along the way who in different forms helped clarify, sharpen the point, the spear tip that John represented. And I think in the initial stories around John's death, he was portrayed as this lone wolf, and intentionally so, John didn't write about any kind of support that he received, but he was receiving it, and John isn't an anomaly. All Nations is a very well-established missionary, mission-sending organization, and they're unusual in that they support unmarried men. Most mission organizations don't, but clearly there's a support system.
And did John want to protect them? Is that why he was vague about who was helping him? That they might be, so to speak, the unindicted co-conspirators.
I mean, I think that's a little bit of the John who got lost in the narrative. He saw himself as something of a secret agent, right. And I mean, he needed to be by necessity careful because what he was doing was breaking the law. There was no question about that. The Indian government didn't want him there. But
there's
I think
still this lawsuit there's still an investigation ongoing too. So there's a certain piece of that.
And weren't the people who took him on the boat, weren't they arrested as well? Because they knew that, or they were in violation of whatever border the Indian government had set around the island.
Yeah.
They were,
Fishermen.
but ultimately not
Fishermen.
prosecuted, or they haven't been prosecuted yet.
I want to ask you about the family itself. They suffered an unimaginable loss, and they have released this diary. How do you negotiate what you are willing to do? How are you going to give voice to John's words, to be sensitive to their loss, but also tell the story that you feel compelled to tell?
I think my answer to that would be, as it's really the operating principle of all the documentary work that we've done, which is, can I sit in a room with them and share it, and be proud to do that? And it might be hard, but can I feel like I've been truthful, I've been compassionate, so I guess I imagined doing that as we set our course to make this film, and I hope that we have the opportunity to do that. We've invited them to watch the film in whatever form they would like to do that. So I think that's just whether they're on camera or not, the obligation you owe your subjects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I love saying this word because I've made it up, but I feel there's a certain amount of de-meming of this story that I feel needed to happen. When I read it, when it went global, it was flattened quite a lot. And I think there's obviously a lot of complexity to him and his family and the history of everything. But I do feel that, he's already out there. Right. In a big way.
And I think to be respectful of his faith and I think we worked hard to gain the access to the people around John who are still supportive of him, Levi and Jimmy and All Nations and Cameron. And I think ultimately that community will have to decide for themselves how they feel about the film. And I think we certainly have a viewpoint, and I think that it's probably clear to you who speaks for us in the film, and then the choices we've made and how we've structured the movie. It's not that we're not hiding behind anybody and how we feel. I think we do judge John, but we're also, we don't judge people of evangelical faith, but we do question missionary work. And I think that a guiding question in the project was, tell us what good missionary work looks like.
Right. Probably no missionary work is what it looks like, but okay. Well, that's a different conversation. Like narrative filmmakers, documentarians cast their film. You have an amazing character in Dan Everett, who to me is like the soul and spine of the movie. Can you talk about meeting him, and you obviously hold back a spoiler about his own faith journey. Now that we've seen the film, we can talk about it. How important was he to the story, and what did he give you that no other person could have given you?
Well, there are very few ex-missionaries, I've discovered. Dan may be the only one we could find, or at least who's willing to be public about his
And
renouncing.
also who walked the walk on the level that he did.
That the combination of the two, Dan has had a fascinating life. He's, a magnetic personality. He's very vulnerable and open too. And he wrote a book, which is a wonderful book about his experience. I don't think we recognized how important Dan was to this film until we really started to knit it together and really question how much screen time could Dan take up in this story. And the answer is actually quite a lot, because of the journey that he goes on and how much he mirrors in sort of an inversion of John's story. He felt for us and for people coming to the story a kind of an absolute necessity. And I do wonder about ex-missionaries and where they are, and is he really a unicorn, and are they just not always so willing to share how much that experience may have cost them in their lives and their faith.
I've got a couple more questions, and we have time for a couple of audience questions. I'm going to ask you about Nat Geo, because Nat Geo, mostly through the magazine in a certain era, was very much propagating the myth of the white savior and the noble savage. And that, is probably, that history is probably something that is part of John Chau's thinking and a lot of other missionaries. What were the conversations like with Nat Geo? Because, this is a little bit of truth and reconciliation for Nat Geo about their role, and how did that play out with the production company?
I think that, I'll first just say that there was a natural inclusion of the Nat Geo part of things because they'd written this article about the North Sentinel Island, so it didn't feel, it felt organic to the story we were telling, and I think that's part of it. And I think it's also just, we are living in this time now. We are all reckoning with the stories we've told and the stories that we've taken in, and I think they are very much embracing that too. And so it was really, it was huge to our process that this was part of what we were allowed to do, as was Dan Everett being included in this film. These were really what made us feel comfortable with telling this story in a whole, in a multifaceted way that we needed to.
John read National Geographic magazine too.
Yeah.
That was part of his faith, and very much.
I'm going to ask you about one last thing. Bobby Parks, at the end of the film, in martyrizing, I think that's a verb, and making John a martyr, uses the verb invade. It doesn't feel random, but I'm wondering, you're not mind readers, but in people making John a martyr, is that a way for them to maybe defend or not address their own complicity? Are they wrestling with that, even if it's not always something that they're saying? Did you get a sense that they are questioning what they could or should have done differently, or are they all in?
Well, I spent some time with All Nations, and they did not. They did not appear to be really. I think that they grieved John, who they knew, but I think they accepted that his death was the price they pay for the work they're called to do. And I don't think that they felt any culpability, that just is the risks. As Jimmy Shaw says, it's like doing a backflip, and that when you do a backflip, sometimes you mess up. And that's sort of a position, and then the sort of naivete, I think, in a way, that they could run a simulation in Kansas City and expect that somehow that would prepare John for engaging and encountering the North Sentinel East. On the other hand, as Adam points out, he really put his faith, his life in the Lord's hands, and they may feel, as Jimmy actually Dan points out, that his death is the fertilizer for the fields to come. And they were, off the record, I'd say pretty confident that people would follow in John's footsteps.
I think they will.
And that's a desired outcome.
Absolutely.
On that happy note, we have time for some audience questions. I don't know, we have a microphone that's gonna, yeah, we do. So there's a mic. It's put up your hand. I see somebody. You got it. Go ahead.
Well, I noticed that there's no lower thirds throughout the whole film. Was that an intentional choice?
You want to talk about that?
We forgot them. Yes, absolutely.
No idea who did it.
No, that's great. I love it's like a documentary filmmaker question too, and I want to have a panel at the next IDA conference about lower thirds. I'm going to be
describe the
I'm going to
issue?
be on it with anybody who wants to join me.
For anybody who doesn't know
I'm
what
actually,
a lower third is.
I'm finishing a film that has we're finishing a film that has a ton of lower thirds. But in this film, I think there are so few people we talked to, and we felt like who they are was clear enough, and I think that we had some interesting conversations about this choice, and I hope it doesn't create. It wasn't to create intentional confusion for the audience, but really, I think to. How would you?
Are we allowed to ask a question in a Q&A?
Yeah, why not?
Do you feel like you need them?
Explain the concept
So
a
the
little bit.
lower third is when a person appears in an interview, their name and sometimes their
Title.
affiliation or title or whatever.
Right. For me personally, I could kind of assume who those person are, like
Right.
those people are. Some of friends, some of our scholars that have done some research themselves. So I could have guessed.
Right.
Yeah.
but
I mean, we had often they wrote books, so that was our version of a lower third, right? And again, to Jesse's point, there were so few people. Some films have many, many people. It's really critical that you differentiate who is on what side of what issue, whatever.
Although I'll say in our just for the filmmakers in the house, when we were having this internal deliberation, and I was really kind of questioning. I think we were questioning our choice.
No, never. I was.
I happened to watch Hotel Terminus, and and there's about 150 interviews in the film, and no one is ID'd. And I didn't even occur to me in a way that like I have no. It's like I can follow what's happening. What information do I need here? And I just
fiction films don't name
it. Sort of
people,
gave me
for
permission.
instance.
Not that I needed that permission from that filmmaker or that film, but in a way it was like there's a convention we have here. Why do we have this convention? Must we have it in all films? Okay. Well,
one last thing about this, and then we got to move on. The one thing is that with Dan Everett, lower thirding him was going to be really tricky, right? Because is he a professor, ex-missionary? What is he? If we're naming other people as scholars or whatever,
And it kind of spoils
pastors.
his turn. Okay, a couple more questions. One more question, sorry. Pass it to your left. Thank you.
Hi, I'm curious if you've started to get response. I can see how if you grew up with a part of my family had some missionary background, extended family. I could see them seeing this film and going, "Oh my gosh, this is so sad, but also inspirational," like you're saying. And then I could also see this as absolute warning call to never go down this road. Do not do this. And hopefully the Indian government is truly protecting these people. What has been the response so far? Can you just talk a little bit more about maybe have you had both sides and been surprised you're getting positive from both camps?
We've just started to take the film out. It's just been in 2 festivals, but we did at Telluride have Levi Davis come, who's still
3 pastor brothers.
Yeah. He's still faithful, and I think for us, he's still processing the film and his loss of his friend, but I think he felt the film was compassionate and respectful. I think we're super interested in engaging the faith community in ways that we can and bring this film to them and hopefully provoke conversation. And we made this film called The Overnighters and really had extraordinary conversation in churches with congregations and pastors. I mean, it's really, I think, would be the dream for this film to have those conversations, and I would love to share it with mission sending organizations and young prospective missionaries and people who've done mission work, and because I'm sure that they'd have really interesting things to say. So I think National Geographic has engaged a faith consultant to help us chart those waters, and I hope that the film, there's a skepticism, I think, of work from us, National Geographic, the secular documentary community, and we have to overcome those. But I think we're proud of the film and believe that it can inhabit that space in the conversation. And I think there's not enough work that does that. And I think that's what motivated us to make the work. So how we realize that, fortunately, we have a partner who's going to help us try to do that.
I'm going to ask this last question. I don't see this as a movie of faith. Faith plays a role, but it's a movie about choice, and it's a movie about how people see the world and how they might be infected or polluted by ways that other people see the world. It's a lot like, I've referenced this before, when John Krakauer wrote his first story about Chris McCandless, he didn't understand what was going on in his mind, and his book, Into the Wild, got into what was going on in his mind, and it explained the choices that he made. Even if we might have disagreed with them, we understood him as a human, which I think is what your film does about John. We might disagree with his choices, but we understand who he is as a person, which isn't a question of faith, it's a question of humanity.
And we said to ourselves, it's a story about stories.
Right.
So, and we have our stories too, and I think this film maybe asks us to think about those stories as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of disagreement or conversation to be had about whether what community thinks about what he did is right or wrong, but one thing that to me is pretty common is that John definitely centered himself at the center of this story. And I think we're questioning just that, which is, again, all the people who are reflecting back are realizing the picture's much bigger than you. And to decentralize yourself from that narrative becomes a theme of the film, again, whether you're of the faith community or secular.
But you all can be evangelists for this movie. I think it's important.
Amen. Amen.
I
John.
think it's important that you
good.
tell people what it's about, and if you like it, recommend it, because I think this is an important movie, and I think it's important for people to know about it and talk about it and see it and discuss it. So go off and serve the Great Commission to the mission. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Amanda,
John.
Jesse.